Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. Today we're looking at chapter 11, Paul's instructions to the Corinthians about how they partake of the Lord's Supper. We're going to begin to read at verse 17 of chapter 11. Now we saw yesterday Paul had introduced the topic of the Lord's Supper in chapter 10, and he told them that to participate in the Lord's Supper is to fellowship with the Lord and to fellowship with the other members of the church as you receive the communion together. Now he's continuing that thought, and we see immediately there are some problems that have arisen in the Corinthian church about how they are partaking of the Lord's Supper, and it has to do with their fellowship. Starting at verse 17. Now in the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. Now we can see immediately Paul has a deep concern. Your meetings, your coming together as the church, the way you are partaking of the Lord's Supper in your worship is doing more harm than it is good. Now this is serious. When your participation in Holy Communion is doing more harm than good, what in the world is going on? Well, Paul begins to explain. In the first place, he says, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. Now, this harkens back to the first few chapters of the book when he was dealing with the problem of divisions in the church. And that sense of divisiveness even applies to how they partake of the Lord's Supper. And Paul says, I know this to be true. I've heard about it. It is true. He goes on. No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. And as a result, one person remains hungry, another person gets drunk. Don't you have your own homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. There was something about the way they received the supper that was dividing the church, and it almost seemed there were haves and have-nots in the church, and those who had more of the world's goods were lording it over those who did not have as much of this world's goods, and it was causing great animosity, it seems, within the church, even humiliating those who were poor, materially speaking, in the life of the church. Paul says this cannot be. The Lord's Supper is supposed to be a time of fellowship among you, and yet you're divided into groups, and some are mistreating others. It's just not a good thing. Now from this we learn several things. First, we learn that the partaking of the Lord's Supper in the ancient church, at least in the Corinthian church, revolved around a fellowship meal together. Now, this is different from our tradition today. Most of us grew up in churches where the partaking of communion or the partaking of the Lord's Supper does not involve an entire meal. It does not revolve around a fellowship meal. Normally, it comes at the end of the worship service, and all we partake of is a small amount of bread, which represents the body of the Lord, and a small cup, which represents the blood of Christ shed for us. But it doesn't revolve around an entire meal. Well, obviously in the Corinthian church, it revolved around an entire meal. And then perhaps at the end of that meal, they partook of the sacramental part, which would be the Lord's Supper. And Paul says it's that fellowship meal together that's causing the problems. For some of you have plenty to eat, because you're better off in the things of this world, and some of you don't have nearly enough to eat. You're poor in the things of this world, and there's a separation in the church. This should not be, said Paul. This should be a time of fellowship, and yet now it's a time of division, separating the haves, materially speaking, from the have-nots. Paul even says, some of you are actually getting drunk. He says, how can this be a worship service when some of you are becoming intoxicated? So this kind of stuff should not be. Now, we know that in the life of the early church, there was such a thing called an agape meal, which was a fellowship meal, and would often end with the Lord's Supper. And this is what's happening at the Corinthian church. But there's not much agape love. That's the Greek word for love. There's not much love going on. There's just division and groupings within the church over who has more and who has less. And Paul says this is not right. So I can't praise you in this kind of stuff. He says, because rather than being in fellowship with the Lord and with each other, you are divided among yourselves. Later on, Paul would say, this has caused some of the problems in the life of the church that you are experiencing. So we're going to have to deal with this. So keep in mind, the church is all about fellowship, and the way you receive the meal and the way you share the Lord's Supper together should promote the unity of the body, not create division. So we're going to have to correct this, Paul says, and focus on the fact that we are all one in Christ, we are one body, and we're in fellowship with one another. And partaking of the Lord's Supper should certainly not cause division among us. We'll continue this thought next time in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians.